Welcome, everyone. Hello and happy Tuesday. It is the 16th of May, and I am here as Allie, the CEO, founder, ghostwriter, author, and book coach with the Right Place, Right Time. And today I'm doing a free workshop and training called Create Your Story Exhibit, Curating Your Most Relevant Experiences to Empower Your Content. So welcome, welcome, welcome. I want to make sure that those of you who are either here with me live or catching this replay are in the right place. So I want to just start off by saying that this particular presentation today is for those who want to use more story in the content that you're creating. You could be a speaker working on a presentation. You might be working on a book. You might be trying to write social copy or a LinkedIn article to sell a service or to promote one of your big ideas as an entrepreneur or as a leader in your industry. So if you are kind of in any of those spaces, this is really for you. My goal here today is to help you really understand a process for going about and curating stories that you can use to kind of boost what it is that you're writing about or speaking about. So first, let me just like back it up and introduce more of who I am and why this particular training. So number one, I'm an award-winning author. I wrote a memoir called Dear Universe, I Get It Now, Letters on the Art and Journey of Being Brave and Being Me. Um, and that came out in 2020. I'm working on my second book with a colleague now, and that should come out in January. Um, Currently titled Don't Write a Book Until You Read This One. So I'm really excited about that project because that book will be great for aspiring authors who have never written a book before. Um, I'm also a book coach and a ghostwriter currently, but in a former life, I was a copy and content writer. And so through all of these different iterations of what I've done, I have had to incorporate story into the pieces that I've written, either for myself or for others. So somebody recently had said to me, I could really use a storytelling workshop. And when I asked them what that meant to them, what more were they hoping to gain, they said, I know how to draw stories out of others, but I don't know how to harvest my own. And I thought that was a really beautiful way of putting it. I think that we often know how to ask a lot of questions of others that kind of pull out those personal anecdotes or case studies from their experience. And yet, it can be very difficult to sometimes talk about ourselves when we're very focused on the people outside of us. And so I was like, all right, I see a gap. Somebody's got a need. I'm going to try to fill it. And so here we are. So what I want to help you do today in this training is to help you narrow your focus, mine your stories, um, and then think about some ways to actually share those stories for more impact. And at the end, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how you can come and work with me on a book because that's really my sweet spot. Now, what I really want to make clear is that I'm really looking at this from a place of you already have some kind of sense of the type of content that you're working on generally, and loosely what you want to say, right? You have a little bit of parameters around your audience and your content, but you just don't know how to make it more interesting, impactful, or how to kind of strategize what to do with this material. So here we are for Create Your Story exhibit, curating your most relevant experiences to empower your content. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. And that way you've got a visual representation of the material that we are talking about. Um, and I will try to kind of peek at the comments to see if anybody is popping in with anything to say, so I can respond to those as well. So let me get over here to my concept board. I'm going to ignore that for the moment. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to focus in first on this first key element, which is audience. All right. Um, in order for us to create content that's empowering and to incorporate stories into that content, it's really helpful if we know who we're speaking to. It's also helpful if we know who we are in relationship to them. Um, so what do we know about them? What do we know about their needs? What do we know about the results that they would want to get in relationship to what you can actually provide to them? So let's say you are a speaking coach and your clients are entrepreneurs or business leaders who need to brush up on their public speaking skills because they are now finding themselves often in front of an audience, right? And they have to promote their business or their services or products. So you're the speaking coach. They're the people who need help speaking. Where do you meet in the middle? It's almost a way of seeing these as concentric circles. What's the thing that you need, right, from them, and what did they need from you with this particular piece of content, right? So they might need a few tips or tricks or better understanding of what being a good public speaker is. You might need for them to be a future client or lead and therefore come back into your realm, right? Maybe you want them to come over to your website. Maybe you want them to jump onto your email list. Maybe you want them to book a free consultation. Uh, by knowing what you're trying to get out of this particular piece of content and also knowing what they need to get out of this particular piece of content, it starts to help you narrow your focus, right, as to the possibilities of what you could be talking about. Um, so we first want to be thinking, who are we trying to reach? What do they need? What do I also need? And how can I have both of our needs met through what I am trying to say? All right, I'm going to head back over here to just check in with comments just in case. Okay, I'm going to hide this banner so you can see more of this screen. So think about you, think about them, think about where you kind of like meet in the middle. All right. From here, we want to go over to thinking about focus and format. Now, focus is like, what exactly is it that you want to spend time talking about in this particular content? And to me, the focus is really the transformation. What does your audience need to get as a result of what it is that they're reading, hearing, listening to, watching, depending on your content type, okay? And we'll talk about that in a second. So what's the transformation? So going back and using the example of you're a speaking coach and they're a leader or an entrepreneur who needs better speaking skills. What's the transformation you hope that they get by the time they're done listening to you, reading your thing? Okay. Um, is it that you want them to know how they should stand on stage and capture presence? Is it more about how you want their tone to come across in the way that they deliver? Do you want to talk about the use of visual aids because you find that lots of speakers are relying solely on themselves but nothing visual to accompany them? There's lots of different results that they could get from the content, so you need to really, again, think about the need and then how can you get that need met by focusing on a particular thing and by understanding the parameters of the content. So, for example, if you are the keynote presenter at a conference and you have a whole 45 minutes on stage with undivided attention, you have a lot of time and a lot of different ways that you can get that transformation for them. You could use visuals, you could use video clips, you could use, um, obviously, we're going to talk about using story, but okay, you need to know those parameters. So you've got 45 minutes, it's live and in person. Do you know if you're speaking in the morning? Are you speaking right after lunch when people might be sluggish? So know the parameters. If it's a LinkedIn article, right, then you're talking about a long form written piece. Okay, you could use images in that, but you also know that you probably don't want your piece to be 5,000 words or more. People might not read it. If you're working on a social media post, like you only get 3,000 characters in a LinkedIn post. Having an idea of the vehicle for your content is going to help you shape how much time and space do you really have. And that's going to inform you in terms of how fast you need to make this transformation happen, how focused you need to be in your material, and then it will also translate to just how many stories can you include. When you've got 45 minutes to speak in front of an audience, you might be able to incorporate several different stories. And you might be able to have sidebars or slight digressions throughout that 45 minutes. But if you've only got 3,000 characters to work with, You probably can't go broad and wide in your focus. You need to be a little bit tighter in what you're trying to say because you've got less time to say it in, less words to use. And if you're going to incorporate a story, you're going to have to pick just the most important pieces of that story in order to pack the most punch in a short amount of time and space. So, understanding what you're trying to do for them, but then also understanding the parameters are really important to help you kind of gauge just what kind of, word real estate are you working with, um, whether that's spoken or written. There is like, there's so many average words that a person speaks to number of minutes, right? Um, and I would always recommend that even if you're speaking the content eventually, that you draft it out first so that you have a sense of what you're going to say ahead of time, how long it's going to run, and to again try to figure out how you're going to boil it down to the most necessary parts and pieces without losing anyone. So, all right, so we've got know who you're speaking to, know what they need, translates into the result you're trying to get to them in the content, and then how you go about getting that result for them um, can somewhat be chiseled away at by understanding the parameters of the format. Okay, the method in which you are providing the content. Okay. Um, all right. So then we get into this next piece really, which is curating, right? The stories, anecdotes, or case studies that you can use to illustrate the result of transformation. Now you notice that curations up here, and there's three different sections: case studies, personal stories, or other people's stories. So there's lots of different way to incorporate story into the content. You could use examples of success stories that are from your company or your business. And so focus on client successes or client journey, right? You can also use personal stories and experiences that you yourself have gone through if it's relevant. And then you can also use other people's stories, like, well-known names in the industry might have a certain story that they always tell, or maybe there's kind of a famous parable that can be used to illustrate your point. Um, or, maybe a well-known movie or book, right, that other people would be familiar with that you can use as like a metaphor or analogy or comparison for what it is that you're talking about. So there's lots of different ways to incorporate story. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's yours. You can still use it if it's relevant. I think relevancy is really the most important piece here. Is it a good example of what you are trying to get to as your main focus point or the result that you're wanting your people to get? Um, so let's kind of like do an example. So the way that I like to help my clients when it comes to curating stories, mostly in pertaining to their book, right, is to do something that I call drain the well. Now, the well is your mind with all of your ideas, all of the fabulous stuff that's swirling around up there: thoughts, ideas, opinions, feelings, and then all of those memories and experiences that you've been through. And to drain them means to get them out of your head, because when we just keep everything we know up here and we can't visualize it, it's very hard to sort that information, organize that information, play around, move it around like a puzzle. And that's essentially what we're doing. We're kind of dumping all of the pieces of a puzzle onto the table and trying to figure out what we've got to work with. So, if you're doing it in a digital way, it might look like this. Okay. And I'm using Concept Board, which I love as a virtual digital tool for mind mapping and organization. You can also do this using poster board and post-its by placing in the center of that poster board a few things that you're considering or that and then using post-it notes to write all of your ideas on that relate. Now, for the purposes of this example, I'm gonna keep it focused to something that I'm comfortable and familiar with in order for this to be um, more relevant than me trying to come up with an example that I'm not that familiar with. So, for instance, I'm going to say that my audience are aspiring authors, okay, who know nothing about self publishing and are terrified. Okay, so that's who I'm trying to reach. And the result that I want for them is to be aware of common missteps um, for first time authors who are self publishing. Okay. The result for myself is I want them to connect with me and reach out for a 20-minute call. All right. And I want to try to do this as a LinkedIn article. This is my format. Okay. All right. So I've got all of this kind of hanging out in the center. This is kind of my guide, if you will. It's the GPS. And there's lots of different ways that I could take this, lots of different things that I could do. All right. So I'm trying to reach aspiring authors who know nothing about self publishing and are a little bit terrified by what they don't know. Okay. And I know that it's a LinkedIn article, so I could go as long as I wanted, but I probably want to keep it kind of short and snappy. So I kind of need to discover at this point, well, what are the stories, case studies, personal anecdotes that I could share that would be the most relevant, right? All right. So what would be some personal stories or case studies that I could share that relate to common missteps? So, all right. So one story is a personal story. All right. Um, Now, notice how I'm going to put the word personal, meaning this is something that happened to me, and then I'm just going to put the words no budget. Now, that obviously doesn't sound very much like a story, but I don't need it to because I'm aware of what I mean because it's something that occurred when I was writing my book, Dear Universe, which is that I didn't go into it having a budget written down. And so I was just kind of paying for things as I went and eventually was like $10,000 in. And while I made it work, it would have been good to have known in advance of going on this journey what I was looking at for costs, right? So I made my own mistake um, in self publishing when I didn't sit down and have a budget. Um, so I could use that example. Um, Now I'm gonna classify this one as other. Um, I'm gonna paraphrase this as crappy looking Amazon books. Um, Now this is not necessarily a personal story. It's something more of an observation. I order Amazon books all the time, or books off of Amazon, I should say, and then I get them. And the marketing description online seemed really great. Cover didn't seem that bad, looking at the thumbnail, and then the book arrives, and I find that it's pretty crappy. Like, it doesn't actually look that nice in person. And then I start to read it, and the content actually isn't really all that great. And then I look for the publishing information, and I realize that it's a self published book, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, except when there are crappy self published books, it makes good self published books look bad. Right? It continues to keep this idea of self publishing like it's not a great thing going when there are people who are not doing it very well, right? So I could talk about my observations of looking at crappy self-published books um, and what some of those things have been that I have seen, right? Um, all right, all right. Um, I could do a case study client story of, you know, uh, Susan, indie publishing, and I'll put take chart. Okay. So Susan was a client of mine. She independently published, um, which is a little bit different than self-publishing. Uh, However, she still, as the author, as a first-time author, did a fabulous job of making sure she had a quality book in the end and being super invested from start to finish, right? So I could use the story of Susan as an example of who the aspiring authors I'm trying to speak to in this linked article um, would want to kind of look up to or emulate, right? Because this particular client did it really well from start to finish um, and avoided a lot of common missteps. right? Um, Now I'm going to put professional, um, and I'm going to put professional because this is something again that I observe as what I do, right? But I have the observation of how many people go for bestseller status. Actually, I'm going to change this personal slash professional. So let's say I want to point out in this article that a common misstep might be focusing too much on bestseller status for aspiring authors. I might talk about my personal experience and what I learned while I was working on my book trying to get bestseller status and how much like the magic of bestseller was ripped away when I learned how it really works. I could also provide the professional opinion when I see other people focusing too much on the bestseller campaign and not enough on the other things that I personally and professionally think count more. But I can do this through the lens of working on my book, Dear Universe, right? Another personal story I could share is that I'll call it the first night typos. First night that I had my copy of Dear Universe, I was reading it in bed, and within like the first 10 pages, I found a typo, regardless of how many times I looked at this thing and reviewed it and proofread and had other people proofread it. There was still a typo. In fact, I just found one this week. Um, so, but a common misstep for aspiring authors are people who don't go through external editing at all, so you can imagine how many more typos there would be for somebody who didn't even bother to take that step, right? Um, so I could talk about like even in my own experience busting out all the stops, there were still typos. What are some best practices for avoiding that, right? But do it through the lens of my experience, right? Okay. Um, I could talk about how the only reason that Dear Universe has really gotten the visibility that it has over the last 3 years is because I've continued to promote it and put myself out there and not just let it be published and sit on a shelf, right? So again, using my personal experience with my book and being a self-published author, talking about how the times that I've promoted it, it's gotten readers. The times that I haven't, it's not being picked up, it's not being bought. um, Now, I'm not going to fill in all of these other post-it notes. I think you get the gist. Here's the thing. If I'm doing a LinkedIn article and I know that I want to keep it short and snappy, I might not be able to use even the 6 examples or stories that I've kind of just brainstormed here, right? Um, I might need to pick 1 or 2 that are going to be filtered in to help make a point, and the rest of the article might just be kind of exposition or narration or commentary. So it's not to say that for every point in a piece that you're creating, presentation, article, social media post, that you have to have a story that goes with it. But having a story to help to be positioned in that material somewhere will keep it more engaging and a little less like you're just talking at your audience. It will bring them in a different way. So let's say you get through this exercise, right? You brainstorm all the different types of story ideas. What's perfect about this is that in doing this brainstorm, you might find that you've got a lot more stories now that you can use for other content. Might not be good for this particular piece that you're kind of narrowly focused on, but might be great for a future piece. So don't throw away your post-its or your concept board, or mind map, however you're doing it. These things are great fodder for additional content later. Um, but think about what you're going to do with this particular piece, and then what we want to be concerned with is delivery. How are you going to deliver that content, right? How are you going to tell the story? So I've only incorporated 3 things, and obviously these are not the only 3 things to be considering, but they're pretty important. So the first one is having a good hook. When you start your article, when you start your social media post, when you start your presentation, having something that's insightful, interesting, shocking, eye-opening, funny, these are good ways to hook your audience to kind of stand to attention and pay attention. Now, I'm not talking about shock factor, and I'm not talking about throwing something that's completely irrelevant as the first sentence of your piece just to see if people are paying attention. To me, that's like clickbait. You've got a title of something just to get people to open it up, and then what's inside has nothing to do with the title itself, right? So you want your hook, your entry point to still be relevant. Um, but starting off strong and not burying the lead, as it might be called in journalism, is a good way to begin to kind of get the audience pumped up, right? You might enter with the whole story, or you might just give a hook and then say, okay, I'm gonna tell you the rest of that story a little bit later, right? To build up that anticipation. The other thing to know is about the story arc of a story. So the story arc you probably learned about in early education somewhere along the way. But to paraphrase or to summarize what a story arc is, it's the natural kind of flow and progression of how a story is told and unfolds. So we usually start somewhere in the story where it's kind of normal, normal for that character or normal for that situation. Then something kind of changes the trajectory of that person or situation until we get into this place of rising tension and falling tension, right? Of something happening and then something happening and then something happening, right? Until it builds up to this kind of conclusion. If we think of the story of Wizard of Oz, right? Like in the beginning, Dorothy's living this kind of what she would consider bland existence where she's overlooked and ignored, living on the farm. And then the tornado comes and changes everything, right? So the tornado changes the story. She lands in a different land, and then she goes on a journey full of highs and lows to get to the Emerald City, all because she's trying to get back home, right? And then finally, at the end of that story, she clicks her heels, she returns. Um, Obviously, I've just given you the Cliff Notes version of that book and movie. But that essentially is the story arc. When you are offering a story within your content, you want to be thinking about the similar thing. Okay, where was this person, when they began, and then what are the highs and lows until we get to the conclusion? In my example, where let's say I decide to use the anecdote of Susan. Um, okay, so when Susan came to me, she was XYZ, right? That's where she started off. That's the beginning of her story. When we started to work together, okay, there's the changing point. We did the following, and then, okay, the journey, highs and lows, right? Until we got to, right, the conclusion. Her book became published out in the world, right? And it looks great and it's wonderful and she's wonderful and the book's doing really, really well. So that's how I could use a story arc to tell the story of Susan within the piece that I'm creating. If I was to tell it about myself and I was to focus in specifically on, let's just say, no budget, right? I might say something like, when I started off writing my book, I had this many dollars that I had allocated to the book, and that was it. I had no budget. And then as I got involved, right, I ended up spending this amount on that, this amount on that, and I had no idea this is how much these things cost. And by the time I was done, I had spent X. Um, right? It's still the natural progression, but I'm not having to take on the full story of somebody going through an entire life or an 18-month journey or anything like that. I'm telling it very quickly. I'm sticking to the most important details of what I need my audience to really understand. So the story arc can still be used even if what you're sharing is a small amount of time or a small example, or a succinct example. The story arc still can happen in that fashion. It just happens in less space. If you've got 45 minutes, you've got more time to work out a story. You can even, have one story kind of arc through the entire of your presentation, but you are not giving it all away at once, right? You're inputting the information you want in the middle of the story. If you have a whole book worth of space, you've got lots of time to tell lots of different stories, or to provide one long story depending on your genre, right? If you're writing a business book, for instance, you might incorporate anecdote, case study, personal story. in little snippets here and there to illustrate particular points. If you're writing fiction or memoir, then you're telling one long story, right? And the whole book is the story arc. So the story arc can really be very flexible, but it is something to be paying attention to. Now, details. This is helping you to actually show your audience what has gone on versus just speaking at them the entire time. Um, you want to provide sensory details sometimes so that they can smell, taste, feel, hear what's happening in that moment that you're explaining. Or you want to be specific, you know. Again, going back to the example of having no budget, I want to be specific about, well, what did I spend on individual pieces of my book, or what was the amount that I had set aside in comparison to what I actually spent, and then saying those figures specifically, right? To say like, well, I didn't have a budget and then I spent way more is not going to help the reader or audience truly grasp what I'm talking about when I say it was a really big misstep to not have a budget. If I was to say, yeah, these really crappy self-published books arrived and that's why you shouldn't write or publish a crappy one, well, that doesn't help the audience know or understand anything that's specific to them that they should be watching out for. Because crappy is subjective. So, what do I mean when I say that? I need to give specifics. I need to be detailed in my description of what I would consider these really terrible books. Um, so, make the details relevant, make them specific. When in doubt, do a sensory audit to figure out which details that go off the senses might help to really make the story come to life. I want to use an example of somebody I heard speak because I think this was a beautifully done presentation that incorporated her story with also the main message that she wanted to provide. I went to a networking event and they had a keynote speaker, and she was there to talk about her movement, which I believe at the time was Love is Kind. And she was in this bright red dress. I mean, she was a showstopper, and I think that was all purposeful and intentional, right? Red was meant to be kind of a color of love, but red as a bold color was also meant to kind of show where she ended up. None of these things, which I put together until after I heard her speak. So she was introduced, she went up to the front of the room, and she stomped one leg kind of out in the front. She used her whole body for this. She stomped one leg out in the front and she put her hands on her hips and she twisted her head. And all of a sudden, she was performing. And she gave us one line of dialogue that she said. And then she stepped to the side and she changed her stance. She might have crossed her arms or pretended to put her hands in her pockets. And then she said the next line of dialogue in a different voice so that what we understood as the audience was that she was giving us this two-person exchange that in the beginning we weren't quite sure if it was fictional or not. What we came to learn was that it was based off of her real life story of escaping an abusive marriage. Um, so she did this kind of like two-part, um, play, if you will. Um, Kind of acted it out, and then she would stop and she would kind of get into a presentation stance and she would give us some information about what she wanted us to learn. And then in other parts of the presentation, she'd get back into that kind of performing mode, playing herself and playing the other person, um, and then come back and give us a little bit more. And then she wrapped up how the story ended towards the end of her presentation. So her um, jumping into the action of something that really happened and using dialogue was really effective as a hook. She kept to the story arc as she told us this thing that had happened to her by giving us a little bit of the beginning, middle, and end of the story throughout her presentation. And she definitely went into details. Um, and not just details from her, personal story, but she incorporated statistics and facts and things about abuse and power dynamics within relationships, And then, of course, she ended with talking about her movement, what she does now. Um, and so it served us as the audience in learning new things about, violence and abuse, but also having good boundaries and communication. She tied it all back to, business things because we were ultimately there as women entrepreneurs to connect with one another. And then she, at the end, invited us to get to know her more and to go grab that freebie. So this all goes back to, she knew who she was, she knew who we were. She tried to take what she's very familiar with and what we needed to blend them together to give us a transformation by the end of her presentation, which she knew she had a certain amount of time for, and then carefully selected the stories that she was going to tell or the information she was going to provide in an engaging way that allowed us to be hooked from the beginning and remember her and her content. Um, so I think that that's a really fabulous example, especially as somebody who is giving a verbal presentation. But we can still do these things even in our written forms. And when I work with clients on books, as an example, we very rarely dive in to just be like talking about the story. I have to have a better understanding of who they are, who they think they're trying to reach, what they think the focus is for them and for their audience. And then what exactly are our parameters around this book? Do they have a sense of length? Do they have a sense of genre? There's a lot of work that we do before we just dive into writing and talking about story. Now, what I want to do next is just talk about, some of the common, roadblocks or mistakes or whatever that I see, in this approach when people are having a hard time thinking about those stories that they want to tell or which stories are relevant, right? So part of it is that people start to think about stories in these like silos. um, they're like, "Oh yeah, I should put a story in here." But they don't necessarily back up the bus to think about, okay, what am I trying to accomplish? Who am I speaking to? What story would actually be the best story, the most relevant story for that, you know, thing that I'm trying to do, right? And so when we think of story as if, well, we should just tell a story, it's like we're telling a story for story's sake, and that's not going to be as effective as really thinking about who and what and why first so that you can then match the story to the rest. Because we all have hundreds of thousands of stories. We've lived long and full and nuanced lives. There's lots of things that we could say or do with story. But if we're just saying, yeah, I need a story, it's like, blindly trying to find one without there being any frame for what we need. So that's one thing, jumping right to the story and working in isolation. Um, Another thing is that people think like once they find, let's say, three stories that might be important or feel important to them, is thinking that they need to use all of the stories. This especially happens in book writing or memoir. We think that every single thing that we've ever experienced or that's ever happened to us should go into, the book. And really, we're just fire hosing our audience. We're packing in things that might be completely irrelevant or not the best example to illustrate what we're trying to say. So less is actually more, and focused is better. So we want to be strategic. This is why I've called it curation, because you are carefully selecting and being intentional about what you're sharing and what you're putting together. Um, and then, of course, another mistake is that then when we've got the stories narrowed down, people want to tell instead of show. And there's room for people to say this happened and this happened and this happened, and not put it down into, a full scene like this one speaker did in her presentation. Um, but sometimes people want to actually be there. They want to see the color of the car. They want to smell the way that the bouquet smelt. They want to be able to imagine the way that that new leather journal felt, whatever the detail might be. And so there is a room for a balance between that narration or commentary and telling what's going on and actually letting people settle into the details of something, slowing the pace down, giving them a little bit more that they can sink their teeth into. Okay. Um, so at this point, as we're kind of wrapping up our time together, um, number one, I really hope that you found some useful information in this training about going forward and trying to really curate some stories and boost your content to be more impactful and to feel better about what you're putting out there in whatever capacity that is, whether it's the social media post or the LinkedIn article. But what I would really like to let you all know is that if you're thinking about a book, a memoir, especially because that's really my sweet spot. And you really need a little extra support and guidance as well as time to kind of ignite your vision and confidence and make a plan, right? Not just sit down and write and think that that's going to be the winning solution, but to actually make a plan. Then I really would love for you to join me for my half day virtual summit that's coming up June 9th. It's called Craft Your Memoir Around the Campfire. Registration is currently open. We're meeting for half a day, and this is a great way for you to kind of wrap your mind around all of these concepts that we discussed because we will touch on audience and we'll touch on result and we'll touch on what you're really aiming for yourself and a number of other things that are really important to kind of getting a solid plan in place before you just decide to sit down and wing it, which is really not my recommendation. So if you're interested in that, please, please, please head over to the registration page, which I will put in the comments of this video, and join me. I would love to have you. I'd love to get you centered on this path and working towards a really well crafted book and one that you feel really, really good about on the other side. So if you're watching this, please post in the comments your ahas, your takeaways, the things that you found really relevant, significant, interesting, or insightful to creating your story exhibit for your content. I would love to know and hear from you. And of course, if you have any questions about the material that you would like clarification on, post those too. I'm happy to come back and respond to those questions. So I look forward to seeing some of you, I hope, at Craft Your Memoir Around the Campfire on Friday, June 9th. It's been a pleasure um, working with you today, and I can't wait to see your content out there in the world full of wonderful, rich, and relevant stories.